Hello everyone, very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists, and as I say, I've put everyone on mute for now, but you can unmute yourself later if you would like to ask a question or make a comment when we get to the questions and answers session. Zion is going to be talking for about 40 minutes, so that's just to give you an indication of when we'll get to the Q&A. Recording the event, so if you don't want to be seen on the recording, you may want to switch off your video. It's entirely up to you. Please feel free to use the chat function, but try not to interrupt the flow of the talk with too many messages in chat, and please don't share any personal details with other participants. You can question in the chat again when we get to the Q&A, if that makes things easier. We're still hosting our virtual coffee morning every Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock. We've had some incredible conversations the last few months, so do join us if you would like to. Also taking advantage of the current rule of Christchurch, and you'll find the details on our meetup site. Our next talk on Zoom is going to be by John Hubbard on architecture and the age of reason in Dorset. Architecture of the Age of Reason in Dorset. John is one of our popular speakers, and he always gives a humanist spin to art, architecture, and literature. So that's John Hubbard on Wednesday, the 28th of October at 7:30. Well, our speaker today is Zion Lights. She has a master's degree in science communication, and she's a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. You may remember seeing her on the Andrew Neil show some months ago. She left XR to focus on promoting science-based solutions to rising CO2 emissions. She lives in Devon and she doesn't fly, drive or eat meat. So would you please give Zion a warm welcome in the normal way? You can either wave or you can do the reactions, and I will unmute Zion. And let's also get you spotlighted as well. I'm just going to pin you, Zion, so you're in full size. Okay, so Zion, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. So to start with a little introduction of my own, I've been a climate activist since I was very young. I learned about global warming, as we called it then, at school, and was really concerned about it, and concerned that no one around me seemed to be doing anything about it. Bugged my parents to recycle, which just annoyed everybody, although they all do it now. And so I was involved in activism from a very young age. At university, I founded the first kind of green society with 2 other members at Reading University, and we campaigned for the university to switch to renewable energy. We campaigned for them to switch to mostly wind, I think it was. So that, you know, put a pin in that because it's a little part of my journey. When you're involved in the environmental movement, in Britain at least, you are surrounded by a lot of perspectives that are not necessarily evidence-based, and you don't necessarily question them because it's not something that anybody sits you down and says. Nobody sits you down and says, be anti-nuclear, be anti-GMOs, be anti-vaccines. It's just all the people around you that you care about, that you're campaigning with, have these beliefs, and so you end up believing them without realizing. I had these beliefs, you know, for a while, and they really started to change when I had my first daughter, because I wanted to know what the truth was about vaccination. I started reading up about it, and of course there's a huge body of research that supports vaccinating your children, but I was surrounded by kind of what we call green parents who were very anti-vaccination and had, you know, all these horrible stories and figures, and of course this whole you know, MMR causes autism, although it's now kind of spread to all vaccines can cause autism, which comes from that retracted Wakefield paper. So the first thing I did was research vaccines, and then the second thing I did was start writing about this and approach a publisher and say, would you be interested in a book that kind of looked at green parenting but from an evidence-based perspective? So there's lots of books on green parenting out there. You know, I had them all on my shelves. I was reading them when I was pregnant, trying to find out what the best way to raise a baby is, and I was really shocked at how you know, full of misconceptions and myths they were. So I wrote this book on green parenting. It was endorsed by Bill McKibben. It was endorsed by Natalie Bennett, who was the leader of the Green Party at the time. And I had some really good press coverage over it, you know, as in the Telegraph magazine. And it was generally well received, but in my community, in my kind of tribe of green parents, it was not well received. So although I had a few people who were really supportive, who loved the evidence-based, you know, approach, I had a lot of hate mail because of the chapter on vaccines. I had, and I'll be honest, although I knew that the anti-vaccine sentiment was there, I wasn't really prepared for the volatility of that response. Now, I'd say we're all more used to it, and we're seeing these protests happen in Trafalgar Square, for example. But back then, it was really news to me, and I thought, oh my goodness, I need to learn how to communicate with these people, which is what led me to go back to university to do a master's in science communication. And one of the most interesting things I found from the discussions I had with these anti-vaccination parents was they would say, look, I like your chapter on breastfeeding, I like the chapter on transport, and I like the chapter on diet, I like the chapter on co-sleeping. It's all really good, you know, because they supported the research basically. And I said to them, this isn't a book based on my opinions. It's literally every chapter is just telling you what the evidence says for each topic. You know, the scientific method and underpinning every chapter is exactly the same. And then they would say, no, because vaccines, that's all to do with big pharma and scientists being misled. And it just opened this huge can of worms, which made me go, wow, I really need to learn how to talk to these groups, because you know, these conversations are important. I'm not sure that I'm approaching them in the right way. And actually, I've just presented them with an entire chapter in this book with all the latest evidence, and that's not enough to convince them. So what am I doing wrong? I went back to university. I went to University of West of England, which has one of the most prestigious science communication departments in the world. A lot of the research on science communication comes out of that department, and it was invaluable. And the first thing they said, so the first two things they said when we all sat down in the class: one, people don't care about facts. Most people don't care about facts. It's not how we communicate. That's not the most important thing. I needed to hear that. And two, if you're in this room, you're already different to most people because you have a high level of science literacy, you care about issues, or science capital, as we call it in SciComm. And that means you have to learn to communicate outside of your bubble, and just remember that we are in this bubble. And yeah, straight away, you know, just went, this is really useful information. Why didn't I know this already? And so I wrote the book. I went into more kind of science writing. I was doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, but I'd left a lot of the groups I was part of. So I left, you know, I kind of left the green parenting community. I wasn't really talks for them anymore. I felt that the vaccines things got pretty nasty. I had people emailing me saying, I'm going to leave you a 1-star review because you'd work for big pharma. It was, you know, it's ridiculous. But I just went, right, I'm just going to go and talk about other things, like, all right, let's go straight back to climate change, care about climate change. Still not much happening in that area. And I stepped out of that group, but it's kind of lonely when you do this, right? There's the reason people belong to these groups or to religious groups, because we're very naturally tribe oriented. You know, it's an evolutionary thing, right? You lose your tribe, you're less likely to survive. It's natural to want to fit in with a group of people. And if you're you know, green-minded, if you care about the environment and you want to be involved, and you only have these kind of groups that are, you know, sorry to say it, but largely anti-science. So when I heard that Extinction Rebellion had been created, I was so excited, because the first thing I saw them say is, we have to listen to the experts, we have to listen to the scientists. And they were quoting the IPCC report, which I'd sat down and read. It took me a whole day to read that 1.5 warming report that came out in 2018. But I was like, yes, I can go into this organization and I can talk about climate change and I can use evidence. This is really important. And so I joined, and they very quickly invited me to be a spokesperson, and did a little bit of that, the kind of spokesperson training that they offered. And you know, it was going really well. I was doing a lot of public speaking for them. I did, you know, BBC Politics Live. I was on TV, Good Morning Britain, like lots of things before Andrew Neil. It was really Andrew Neil that grabbed people's attention, and it was kind of, you know, the bit where I got thrown under the bus, because what had happened is, about 6 weeks beforehand, one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, had made up a figure on Hard Talk, which was 60 billion people would die by the end of the century. And as soon as he'd done it, I was in the media team in Extinction Rebellion, so we had the emails come in from all the journalists around Britain saying, have you got a source? Mr. Hallam's just said this, where's your source? So of course we went straight to Roger and said, we really need to answer this question, where's the source? And he admitted that he'd made it up. He'd made the number up, you know, whether under pressure or because he'd kind of been playing around with numbers himself and done a back of the envelope calculation, I don't know. But this led to 6 weeks of meetings and letters and discussions where a whole group of us, me and a lot of the scientists, said we have to retract that figure because we lose credibility the second we don't tell the truth. And also there are real figures we can use. There's lots in the IPCC report, right, about the things that are going to happen in the world, things that are already happening in the world because of climate change. And it became this huge drawn out battle. Actually, you know, I didn't win. So in the end, they kind of said, look, we're just going to have to support Roger on this. Hopefully people will forget about it. We just have to stop obsessing over 6 billion. And I agreed to do that. And then, of course, I went on Andrew Neil, the Andrew Neil show, and I had all these facts and figures in my head, and I was ready to talk about the issues. And the first thing he brought up was 6 billion. So what a lot of people saw then was this, you know, really naive individual who couldn't defend a made up number, whereas actually what the truth is that I refuse to defend it because it's indefensible, because I know it's made up. But as a spokesperson for this organization, I couldn't sit there and say that because their official line was to defend it. And, you know, I hadn't expected to be asked about it, and it just completely flummoxed me. And, you know, and if anyone's followed this battle, it's become very drawn out because even now they've issued, so after I left XI, in order to regain some of my scientific credibility, I've come out and said this openly, and now they've issued a statement saying they still back that figure. And yeah, so, you know, it's, and I think this polarization is really unhelpful. It's come to this point where, and in this statement, they've kind of implied that I'm a climate denier, which of course I'm not. But I think it's kind of dangerous because it's come to this point where either you support 6 billion and you get called an alarmist, or you don't support 6 billion and you get called a denier. And it, you know, this is not helpful to any of the discussions around climate change. And as I say, there are serious things happening that we need to pay attention to. You know, look at the UN report that says that 40% of the world won't have access to clean water by 2030. I mean, that's not miles away. These are serious issues that are being faced by countries. India's already suffering water shortages, for example. You know, they need serious solutions right now. And so I left Extinction Rebellion, and the story of how I came to advocate for nuclear is that Michael Schellenberger, who I actually hadn't heard of at the time, it's before he'd written his best-selling book, which most people are probably aware of now, but at the time I didn't know who he was. I just saw that several people, I woke up one day and several people had emailed me a story that he had written in Forbes about me, Greta Thunberg, Bill McKibben and AOC calling us all climate alarmists. And of course, it came down to this 6 billion figure. So I messaged him right away because I wanted to clarify that, look, I was not defending a figure, but there are things that we should be concerned about. And we had a very heated conversation on the phone. And then he said, look, I'm writing this book. Can I record this? I'm going to use this conversation. And I thought, oh no, it's going to be Andrew Neil all over again. But I, you know, went with it. I just thought I'm just going to tell the truth and see what comes of it. And bear in mind that Andrew Neil show, you know, it was very well watched. When they put it online, it had something like 2 million views. I mean, I was recognized for it everywhere. It really, you know, this 6 billion thing has not died, basically, which is why I'm still talking about it, because you know, it's still very relevant. Maybe it will always hang around. Maybe I have to accept it. Anyway, so I spoke to Michael Schellenberger, and he was, you know, he's used to getting into these battles with people. He, like Andrew Neil, people see him as a formidable figure. You know, I just try to face people just where they're at, accepting that they're human, I'm human. We probably have quite a lot more in common than we realize. And so it was getting very heated, and then I just kind of threw in there that I said, you know, when I researched you, I saw your TED talk on nuclear power, and I completely agree with you. And it really surprised him that someone who's like a deep green was pro-nuclear, but I was, and it was well before I met Michael. So actually something like 6-7 years ago, as I say, in the environmental movement, you're just surrounded by people who are anti-nuclear, so you naturally are, you don't really question it. Then a friend of mine who's a scientist had sent me a paper on deaths at Fukushima, and now I believed, if you had asked me then, I would have told you Thousands of people died from radiation, and this paper showed that not a single person died from radiation. It was not true. 573 people died at Fukushima in the evacuation process because they panicked. About the nuclear meltdown, not anything to do with the actual meltdown itself. And something like over 20,000 people died from the actual tsunamis. You know, it's exceptional circumstances. But when I read this, I went, wow, maybe I was wrong. So I read about Chernobyl. I just read. There's a huge body of really good research out there. I read everything that was available to me, and I was already convinced. And I was actually a member of the Green Party at the time, and I was so involved as a member. They were talking about, you know, me being a candidate for my area here in Devon, in Exeter. And I went to a Green Party discussion on energy, and it was all about wind power and solar power. And I put my hand up at the end and I asked a question. So the panel had the Green Party members on it and a scientist from the Met Office, which is based down here. And I was not pro-nuclear at this stage, but I was very questioning. So I put my hand up and I said, can I just ask the scientists, do we need nuclear at all? Can we just do it with renewables? I read different things, and I was genuinely just questioning at that point. And the host of the event didn't hand the mic to him. He handed the mic to the Green Party candidate, who just said, we don't need nuclear, and everybody applauded. And it made me really uncomfortable, because I thought, even if we're right, you know, we could have still heard his answer. Like, what's the harm in hearing what an expert opinion is? But I tracked him down afterwards and I asked him the same question, and he said, of course we need nuclear. IPCC has been very clear that we cannot do this without nuclear. And so I was really frustrated with the Green Party for not allowing that discussion to happen, and I ended my membership that day. I emailed them that day and I said, I just cannot support if you're going to be that not just not evidence-based, but against evidence, that you won't even hear opposing opinions. But they actually, you know, their credit, they took that on board. They said they were going to, you know, do a kind of inquiry into what happened and make sure it didn't happen again. So I quit that day and left another tribe, right? And what I learned was I was frustrated with the scientist, because he had an opportunity there to speak to something like 100 people, 150 people in that room, who were only hearing one opinion that wasn't entirely true. And he was there and he could have communicated it, and he chose not to. It was easier for him not to, right? And I felt like he let the side down. Here's an energy expert. He knows we need nuclear. He knows everyone in the room is anti-nuclear, but he won't say it. And he didn't say it, you know, and I was really frustrated. So when I spoke to Mike, I told him this story, and I said, look, I've been an advocate for so long, but there is no room to talk about this in the environmental movement. We're so far from being able to. And I'm starting to get to this point where I think we really need to advocate for evidence-based solutions, because otherwise, if we're going with feeling-based solutions, we're not going to solve anything. We're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to address it at all. And that really worries me. So he was interested in that and said, okay. He went away, wrote his book. And then a few months later, emailed me again, and he said, I'm going to send you a copy of the book. I hope all the quotes I've used are okay. Let me know what you think. And then we had a chat, and he basically said, would you consider advocating for nuclear in the UK? We need someone to do it. You know, it's really important what's happening there. So what's happening here at the moment is that we have 15 operational reactors, and 14 of those are due to be shut down by 2030. Now they need to be shut down. They're really old technology. We don't want to use them anymore. We need new nuclear. So in order to replace the capacity that we're going to lose, we have to build Sizewell C and Hinkley Point C. Now Hinkley's kind of been given the go ahead, but Sizewell still hasn't. So it's not even like I'm campaigning for more nuclear at this point. It's just to keep it at the level that it's been at, so that our emissions don't go up. So I said, yeah, I already knew that. So I said, yeah, I'm happy to try and save Sizewell. Let's see what happens. And he offered, you know, he then offered me a job off the back of me saying that I would do it anyway on a voluntary basis, and that's how I came to be the director of Environmental Progress UK. So nuclear power is a really interesting topic for me. It's actually so similar to talking about vaccines and the anti-vaccination movement. It's very similar to the anti-nuclear, even sometimes they're the same people, but not always. And it basically comes down to fear. So with vaccines, people have fears, right? That's why you can't just challenge them with facts. You can't just throw facts at them. In fact, in science communication, we call this the deficit model. It's this idea, it's this archaic idea of you're a jug full of knowledge, and here's a person and they're a cup and they're empty and you have to fill them up. This is really bad. Don't ever do it. And actually, you'd be surprised how many people do this, especially scientists. And it's been disproved so much that's not the right way to communicate with people. It's the wrong way. What matters is more the communicator trust, and that comes from talking about, you know, it's storytelling, talking about emotions and feelings. So when I spoke to anti-vaxxers, they had all these fears about, you know, so one thing people say to me is, oh, well, I've read that, you know, there's mercury or there's formaldehyde in vaccines. And I say, yep, there is formaldehyde. I'm going to meet you where you're at. There is formaldehyde in that vaccine. You'll find more naturally occurring in a pear. It's just one little thing. I'm not going to throw loads of information at you. It's one little thing. But I'm going to hear your concerns, and then I'm going to address it. Now, that probably sounds really simplistic and like it doesn't work, but there's actually really good data that shows that this does work. When they studied anti-vaccinators, they found 4 groups. One group is the fundamentalist group. It's like the religious group, and you will not change their mind no matter what you do, what you say. So it's worth identifying who they are in the beginning, because anything you say is a waste of time in that area. But the other 3 groups can be reached in different ways. One of the most important things that they found was if they had good communication with their doctor, if they trusted their doctor, they're much more likely to go away and vaccinate. So they tried all these different things, pamphlets, and them to go to talks and all this stuff to make any difference. The thing that they found that made a difference was when they got these doctors who were really well trained in communication specifically on this topic, and they put them in these local surgeries, and they contacted all the people locally who did not vaccinate, and they just said, you're just invited to come and talk to this doctor. No one's going to make you do anything else. You just come and talk to the doctor. They came in with their concerns about formaldehyde and mercury and autism, right? They came in with all of that, and the doctor just listened to them, addressed their concerns, and then the vaccine uptake went up. That's really good research. Shows that, you know, it worked. It's a very difficult method. It's expensive, right? It's difficult to roll out. It did work. That's really promising. These groups did go away and vaccinate after they had the concerns heard. But this is a problem that I find with a lot of scientists. They will laugh at people. They'll laugh at people who are worried about formaldehyde. They'll laugh at people for being worried about radiation. It doesn't change anyone's mind. You know, that's not a good way to communicate. And we all have to accept that, you know, pseudoscience, or woo as I like to call it, it's very common. You know, it seeps in everywhere. I mean, assess all of your beliefs. Are you sure you don't have any in there? I have friends who read, scientists who read horoscopes. You know, I have friends who are scientists who, you know, well, not chemtrails. Actually, I don't have any chemtrails. I do know people who are anti-chemtrails, though. You know, I have all kinds of friends who are very, very scientifically literate. They have high science capital. They do, if they really assess their beliefs, you know, maybe they're religious. You know, I know that's a all the same thing. This is all just woo to me, you know. So we all have those. We all have those deeply embedded ideas. They come from our tribe. They come from the people around us, and it can be quite hard to unpick them. Obviously, with something like vaccination, it's really important that we unpick them, because if we don't, then the herd immunity levels aren't maintained because the vaccination uptake isn't high enough. And what happens? Entirely preventable diseases can come back and ruin people's lives. You know, these are vaccinations that people in developing countries are crying out for, because, you know, their mortality rates and their children are really impacted by the lack of something that we have really easy access to. We're very lucky to have that. So this is very similar to nuclear power. So we are in a climate emergency every day. There's not a day that goes by where I don't see someone, most recently it's David Attenborough, saying, we're in a climate emergency, we need to act on this. Okay, so 73% of our emissions come from energy. That's a really big number. So there is agriculture's in there. It's about 18%, I think, industry's in there. But the biggest chunk, the biggest slice of the pie is energy. We've got to solve our energy crisis. And it is a crisis because at the moment, we still get about 40% of our energy from fossil fuels. It's about 60% altogether. I think a lot of people don't realize this. You can check it any day. You can go to electricitymap.org and it will tell you what today's energy mix is. So I checked it last week, and because our wind power had dropped, we were importing coal. So Britain's still using coal. You know, it's the 21st century and we're still using coal. We're talking about being a climate emergency. We're using one of the most polluting options that are out there. Now, there's a lot of concerns about nuclear power, and this is the things I talk about all the time. So I've covered radiation a little bit, but also waste. Waste is a big thing people worry about. And I used to be anti-nuclear, so I completely understand what people fear, because I used to fear it, right? And actually, when I think back and when I talk to people now about their fears, it's very similar. The idea we had of waste was this kind of green, loopy, corrosive, acidic, liquid. But actually, when I learned what waste is, that it's solid and it's small cylinders and they're buried in layers of concrete and they don't have a lot of power left in them, right? They're used fuel. I just realized, where did that come from? It came from The Simpsons. It came from popular culture, but especially The Simpsons. And when I talk to people now and I hear them talking to me about their concerns about waste, I sit there and I think, you realize you're talking about The Simpsons. Let me show you a waste facility. Look at something like Kovra in the Netherlands. It's a really beautiful waste facility. They've got the waste stored there for it's got to be stored there for like 100 years or something, but they've turned it into a publicly open art gallery. I really want to go there after COVID's over, and it looks amazing, and that's how safe it is. And I even say to people, if you're that worried about radiation, you can buy a Geiger counter and you can just take it and use it to measure, how radioactive. So radiation obviously comes from space, right? We all contain it. It's in food. You can just buy one of these counters. You can measure levels yourself if you really don't believe the scientists, about these sites being safe and not being, at dangerous levels of radiation. In fact, and here, Cornwall has high levels of radiation because it's elevated. Bananas contain more radiation on average because they contain potassium. When it decays, it releases more radiation than other food. So, but these are all conversations that I've been having. But the main point with nuclear is not about defending all of these concerns. It's what I said with vaccines, where actually we need to celebrate. We need to be so thankful that we have and the ability to eradicate these diseases, these viruses that for a long time people just had to deal with, high infant mortality rates. We don't have to do that anymore. That's amazing. And look at COVID. Yes, we're all worried about COVID, all living it, but we don't feel that it will last forever. We know that at some point there will be a vaccine. Thank goodness, right? Although, if people don't have the vaccine, then we're not so lucky because it won't work, right? But it's the same thing with nuclear. I think actually what I came to when I decided to become an advocate, the realization I came to is that we are really lucky that we have this. I don't know what I would advocate for if we didn't have this, right? So wind power is great. We have wind power, about 30% in the UK. During the latest heat wave, the wind dropped from 30% to 4%. Turbines weren't turning, right? The battery storage isn't good enough to deal with that yet. There's no sign that it will be in the near future. So we imported coal. That's just a basic fact, that we still end up having to deal with the issue of intermittency. And we really shouldn't be using coal. I've even had environmentalists say, oh, well, we're phasing out coal, so it's not as bad as it used to be. We should not be using coal. I mean, it leads to so many deaths a year from air pollution. That's before you talk about climate change, the impact on the atmosphere. And what about the people that have to live by these coal plants? I spoke to a family in Poland who live near one. They can't open their windows because they're covered in soot. I mean, you all know this and everybody claims to know it, but really think about the actual environmental toll. Think about these people, and they're always poor because they can't afford to move out of those areas. Their children have high levels of respiratory issues. Lung issues are really common, and cancers are really common. And even just, yeah, all right, that's one example of me saying we shouldn't be outsourcing the environmental and human cost to other countries because we don't want to embrace a cleaner alternative. But actually, it's even bigger than that, because data exists on the safest source of power shows nuclear is at the top with wind and solar. In fact, solar is slightly below them, but wind and nuclear are the safest. And then you've got coal right at the bottom and you've got gas somewhere in the middle. That's just what the data shows. So nuclear actually is the safest. And that research is taking into account Fukushima and Chernobyl. It's taking into account all of the meltdowns, which have been completely blown out of proportion and reported in such a way to create all these fears, in exactly the way that people had all these fears about vaccines and their children getting sick and their children, being poisoned and big pharma. It's exactly the same thing that's happened with nuclear, and that really, really needs unpicking, because it's the best chance we have to get our emissions down. And if you talk about climate change, all it really is about getting our emissions down. Dr. James Hansen did research between 1971 and 2009 and calculated that 2 million lives had been saved by switching to nuclear. And that's looking at things like air pollution, And in the industry, you know, the mining process involved in fossil fuels extraction, that's a really high. People don't realize how high they are. Again, they're much higher than adding together all the meltdowns that we know about. What's happened there is a huge miscommunication. And I think the industry's failed because the industry didn't really stand behind their product, and they don't now, really. They don't even advocate for it. I think the industry's really weak. When people accuse me of working for the nuclear industry, I just laugh at them and say, yeah, I wish they had people like me. They don't stand behind their own product. Imagine if they were like the fossil fuel lobbyists. We all know what they're capable of. We all know that they funded climate denial. You know, this isn't BP and Exxon. This is not the really easy things to look up and research. So it's really, you know, so Boris Johnson has just made this commitment very recently to more wind in the UK. Now, on the one hand, I don't think that it's even going to happen. The calculation show something like he'd have to be building a turbine a day. So I just don't think it will actually happen. I think it's good that we have more of a commitment to renewables. I think that is good. But he said that it would be enough to power all of our homes. That's not true. His proposal of the amount of wind that he's proposing would power half of the homes. It would provide electricity for half of the homes in the UK. So that's not a bad figure, but we have to think about where the rest is coming from. And this is where I keep coming back to when I say to people, do you realise we still mostly depend on fossil fuels? Even if you take out, let's take out the stuff about air pollution, let's take out the fact that it's causing climate change. And let's look at the human cost here. There are countries around the world that do not have a high quality of life. Let's take India, right? My parents migrated to Britain from India, from the Punjab, little village in the Punjab in the 1970s. My grandfather fought in the World War for the British, and his son was given a free pass to come over to work in the factories here. At that time in Birmingham, there was a huge kind of boom of industry, and there were lots of factories which are pretty much all derelict now. And he came over here and was able to work. And you know, the reason he wanted to leave his home and all his family behind, which is what he did, is because they live in poverty. They live in complete poverty. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to healthcare. They do not have a high quality of life. They do not have a high life expectancy. Everybody says they understand what poverty is. We really understand what it is if we're telling these people that they now cannot develop because we don't want them to use fossil fuels. Now, believe me, I want the world to be weaned off of fossil fuels. It is going to cause a complete destruction of the world as we know it. It's already happening, right? There's no question about that. 97% consensus of scientists, you know, if you know scientists and how they work, that's a really high number for them to all agree, you know, at 97%, that's happening. But we need a solution. What's that solution going to be? You know, leapfrogging doesn't tend to work where where countries just skip from a low energy source to a high. It usually goes kind of wood, coal, gas, you know, nuclear is right up there at the top. India's nowhere near. I mean, India gets like 3% from nuclear. It's nowhere near being able to invest. You know, they want to burn fossil fuels. They want to burn fossil fuels. And to me, this makes this a kind of moral obligation on our part that let's be honest, we pumped all this stuff into the atmosphere. Yes, we didn't know it was happening. You know, we didn't mean for it to be a bad thing. We didn't realize that it was causing this complete destruction of the natural world. But now other countries want to do it. We can't deny them that right. We need to get our emissions down. We have a moral obligation to get our emissions down to net zero as soon as possible. We've got to do it as soon as possible because it's going to allow them to have a little bit of leeway in a little bit of ability to grow, you know, a little bit of growth so that they can have access to things that we don't have. And again, going back to the poverty, people just don't realize this. So I have a cousin in this village. I have lots of cousins in the Punjab, and I have this cousin who I met when I visited before I gave up flying, like 15 years ago, whatever it was. And he had fits as a baby, and my parents sent money over. So it's very little, you know, their money it's nothing to us to send money over there. It's worth so much over there. It costs very little, but they sent the money over, and so that he could have access to medication, he could get some basic anti-epileptic medication. And even with the money, it wasn't an issue of money. They couldn't get access. They couldn't get regular access because the nearest hospital was 6 hours away. The roads are just dirt tracks for most of the way. Most of them don't own cars anyway. Dad tried to hire a driver. Basically, they couldn't do it. And he became permanently brain damaged because he couldn't get access to something here. No, we would all have easy. We wouldn't even think about it. My friend here, actually, my closest friend here, his daughter was born a year ago. She did have epileptic fits. They put her on a huge concoction of drugs. They kept her in hospital until they found the one that was working. They took them off one at a time, you know, because they really needed her not to have fits, because it can really damage a baby's brain. When they found the one that worked, they gradually weaned her off the other ones, and now she doesn't take any meds at all. They had to stop fits, and they had to do lots of tests to find out what was wrong. Turned out there was nothing. You know, so they said sometimes these things happen and they don't even know why, but ruled out all the major things that it could be. It's nothing. I don't think it's anything serious. It might have slowed her development somewhat, but she's going to have a high quality of life. She's going to have a good life. She had access to medication. My cousin, they did not have access to that medication. He sits in a chair 24/7 and he can barely speak, and he's my age. You know, this is the reality of not having a high quality of life. This country needs development. They want development. They're not going to be able to do it without abundant amounts of energy, which is what we had. It's what we had. We have a moral obligation to get our emissions down as soon as possible and allow some of these other countries to develop as they need to. I know it's complicated. I know it's easier to just say, well, you know, we're getting along fine. We just need to use less. This is what I hear all the time. And I'll tell you what, 15 years ago, that's exactly what I was saying. I've been in this movement a long time. I wrote an entire book on how to lower your carbon emissions. And I have a very low carbon footprint. But first of all, not everyone can live this way. It's quite a privileged way to be able to live. Secondly, it is hard. I have 2 children. It is hard not being able to drive. You know, I found it difficult. And I don't expect most people to do that. I think most people will always go towards you know, progress and convenience, whatever's easier, whatever's cheaper. It just makes sense. And on those points, you could argue, sure, the government can make these things easier. And I used to argue that, you know, it's all about top-down decisions. But then I saw this report. It was a Green Party report on zero carbon, and it showed how we could get, through reducing our consumption, we could get emissions down enough to just use renewables. That's what the report showed. And it said that we needed a 40% reduction of how much energy we use. And I actually went to a discussion of this with Caroline Lucas, who was presenting the research, and I said, my hand up, and I said, you know, 40% is all well and good for each person. First of all, a decade of behavioural science has not found a way to get people to do that. I've spent 15 years trying to get people to do that, and it hasn't worked. So I don't think it's realistic unless you're saying it should be authoritarian and that it should be, you know, like an eco-fascist thing where people are told to do it. She said, no, we don't want that. So, okay, well, first of all, it's not realistic. But secondly, 40% is all very well and good, but what about hospitals? And when you're talking about intermittent power, what about hospitals? You know, we can go and build solar farms in India. This is an experiment that happened recently. It's actually a failed experiment, which I won't go into, but you know, it's intermittent power. What happens when the hospital doesn't have power? If there's a blackout, people on important machinery, what will happen to them? What happens to the fridges that have to be at a certain temperature? Keep the vaccines live. You know, that it's just not, there's no way that is the solution. And I admit I advocated for it for a long time, but I've realized that numbers don't add up. It just doesn't add up, scientifically speaking. You look at all the evidence, it just doesn't add up. And actually, you know, you can look at examples like in Germany, they had this project called Energy Wind. I recommend that you look up data on this, you know, if you're interested, because they had this project which was supposed to be to tackle climate change, and they said, we're going to phase out coal, we're going to phase out nuclear. The first thing they did was start shutting their nuclear plants. And the first thing that happened is, even though they put billions into renewables, into the best tech that they could, emissions went up because they had to import coal whenever the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't shining. That's not propaganda, that's not a conspiracy, that's just a fact of what happened. People don't want to hear it. Now, I wouldn't have wanted to hear it 15 years ago when I was advocating for 100% renewables, but the numbers don't add up. And as you know, if anyone's aware of Dr. David Mackay, this is what he said. He said, I'm not pro-nuclear, I'm pro-arithmetic. The numbers don't add up. And he wrote an entire book on this, which is free to read online, called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It's really worth reading because it's just data. You know, it just shows you what we're able to do and how we can do it. And you've got to have nuclear as a big part of the mix there. And I think really, there's no reason that we shouldn't have it here. You know, we talk about waste. I've addressed some of that. We can talk about fear of radiation. We can, you know, and I've already said, well, we're using fossil fuels which are exponentially worse. We can talk about cost. We're spending 80 billion building HS2. You know, everybody says there's the cost of dealing with climate change, just it should be irrelevant. Sizewell will only cost 20 billion. that will, you know, power 6 million homes. These plants can run for 80 years. You know, Fessenheim, that they just closed in France, gave them 50 years of clean energy, and they actually closed it. They didn't decommission it because it had any faults. It never had any faults. They decommissioned it because Greenpeace and other groups were heavily campaigning against it, which worries me because France has a really good energy mix. They have a strong energy security policy, which means they have 75% nuclear. And that's, you know, if they start phasing that out, if they start phasing out nuclear, what do you think is going to happen? Their emissions are going to go up. That's what happened with Energy Wind, their project in Germany. It will happen in France. And this is during a time when we're supposed to be bringing emissions down. Now, I think some of this is the fault of the environmental movement that I've been a part of and still am a part of, because we confuse all the issues. So Extinction Rebellion did this as well. You know, Extinction Rebellion is not just campaigning about climate change. It's also campaigning for system change. It's mixing up two different arguments. What use is system change if we don't have a habitable planet to live on, right? We know this is the only known habitable planet in the universe. We can have dreams of settling on Mars, but they're just dreams. Right now, this is all we've got. Climate change has to be the priority. We have to, and all it means is getting our emissions down. We have to do it, and it's not impossible. There's an entire IPCC report with an energy section by Working Group 3 in the 1.5 warming report that lays out how to do it. And it says in the energy section, nuclear, renewables, carbon capture, storage. There's 4 different scenarios of how you can add up the numbers, but the idea is there, and that's for reaching net zero by 2050. Now, at the moment, we're on track to miss that. There's no way that we are going to meet that target by 2050. There are no plans or policies in place, and that includes this latest idea about wind, because it's just such a small amount. It's something like 70% of our energy that Boris Johnson's plan will actually deal with. That's it, 70% supply. The rest is still going to come from fossil fuels, and I really think we have a moral obligation at this point to just wean ourselves off them. You know, especially when you consider what's happening in developed countries, and when you think about, you know, the poverty that people live in. And let's look at that again. These people are the ones that will suffer most. So you often get these green groups like Extinction Rebellion saying our children are going to suffer, you know, and I've been guilty of this because I'm worried about my children, and I'm worried about whether they're going to be able to have children, or worry about the world that they're inhabiting because of the mistakes that we've made, you know. But ultimately, they're still going to be better off than my relatives in India. My relatives in India are all going to have to migrate because they're mostly farmers and they're already having problem with extreme drought. Where are they going to migrate to? They're not going to come here. Our borders are shut, right? Where are they going to go? They're going to go to different parts of the country. Well, the research shows that it's not just the villages that will be affected. It's also places like Delhi. It's the cities as well. There's millions of people who won't have access to water, clean water. And there are other options. There are other technology-based options like desalination, you know. But guess what that requires? It requires abundant amounts of energy. Whichever way you slice it, this is the debate that it comes back down to, and this is why I've chosen to advocate for it. It's a very difficult thing to advocate for, but I think it's the most important. And if I make any, you know, headway on this, I'll be saving potentially millions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere. That's what climate change, you know, that's what it means to address climate change. So, you know, Extinction Rebellion have done good things. Before Extinction Rebellion, I was talking about climate change, and it was like bringing it up in a conversation, you could hear a penny drop. I'm sure lots of us remember this if we were talking about it. I was, you know, going to events to talk about it and just watching people just kind of depressed or just say, yeah, it's worrying, and go back to everyday life. Extinction Rebellion completely turned that on its head. They did that with Fridays for the Future. It wasn't just them. And, you know, they made things like climate crisis and climate and ecological emergency, and, you know, all of those terms. They came up with those terms, and now everybody uses them. They helped to shift the dialogue, and that was a really important thing that they did. Now we need to look at what the solutions are and make sure that we're implementing the right solutions when we're talking about tackling the climate emergency. And actually, we're so far from the right solutions. I just watched the Life on Our Planet documentary by David Attenborough, and it begins showing Chernobyl as an example of the worst of humans. Showing Chernobyl when fossil fuels are destroying our entire planet and have the least safety record. They have the highest number of deaths, even including Chernobyl and Fukushima. He showed that as the worst example, and then at the end he said that the solution was renewables. And I think actually, if we make that mistake, and because our gut feeling is that renewables are good because, you know, it's the wind and it's it's the sun and it's natural. I think there is this idea that it's natural, you know. He kind of makes that argument, if anyone's seen the documentary, because a lot of his show is about how we need to be careful about the way we develop, and then it goes on to say we need to develop more renewables. If you're not aware of, you know, environmental cost of renewables, I would urge people to look that up as well. You know, first of all, on wind and solar farms, they require a lot of land. In Britain, we need to rewild a lot of our land to actually to get our emissions down. It's really important, you know, and there's really good work being done on that by George Monbiot, Rebecca Ridley, and their Rewilding Britain campaign. You know, I'm not worried about that. I think we're going to take care of it, but there's no way that you can also use that land for wind farms. There's just no way. You look at Sizewell. I've been up to Sizewell to see the Sizewell B plant, which is where Sizewell C would also be built. It's a small compact site, and it runs for what, 50 to 80 years. Wind farms take up masses of land. If you just look up the data, again, I think this is in Mackay's book I read years ago, it just shows you the land mass. I mean, how is that possible in a country like Britain? It's just not, you know. So yeah, we need this. You know, I could talk about this forever, but let's bring this to a close, because I can see lots of questions. The point that I've got to is that we can't solve any of these problems without advocating for solutions, but they have to be evidence-based solutions, and that should not be a radical notion. It is, because traditionally and today, green groups, and climate change has kind of fallen into this left-wing green group driven issue, when really it should be an everybody issue, but it has fallen to these kind of groups. They tend to ignore the science. They tend to cherry pick the science, and that's dangerous. And we can't allow decisions to be made based on gut feelings. We really need to tackle the climate emergency using evidence, using raw data. And then, you know, there's a discussion to be had about things like system change. I'm not saying that, you know, that's not important, but first of all, we need to make sure we have a habitable planet for us and as many species that we can save from extinction as possible, and for our children and their children.
Zion, thank you very much for a really inspiring talk. I'm just going to remove the spotlight from you so on the screen with many possible. Yeah, okay, we've got a few questions popping up in the chat. If you know how to raise your blue hand, that's also helpful, and I can get to you in that way. And the other way of doing it is the old-fashioned way of raising your hand, but I might not see you actually on the screen. So the blue hand or chat is probably best, but I can see Paul Laurie is doing the old-fashioned. That's fine. I'll get Paul. First of all, though, let's go to, there was a question from Sophie asked to what extent would Zion save? I don't know if you saw that, Zion. The Chernobyl TV drama.
I can see it, but my screen seems to be freezing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I haven't actually.
Zion, there was a question about the. Right. Okay, go on.
I haven't actually watched it, mostly because I think it would enrage me. I've seen a few thorough debunkings, so if anyone's interested, I just urge you to look them up. It's very much informed by drama, and it's very much playing on this idea of how nuclear is just the worst thing humans have ever. Nuclear power is a gift to humanity. If we use it right, you know, we're not really using it at the moment at all. Not in Britain. We have about 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear. Which is, as I say, you know, very low compared to places like France. But you know, I think it's kind of natural play on this. If you want to create a drama, you want to create a sci-fi. Let's use sci-fi as an example. You know, science fiction books, science fiction storytelling. It takes technologies to the extreme, doesn't it? So things like Black Mirror. Let's look at this idea that people have for social media or new AI. What's the extreme? The problem is, as journalists do this as well. So, oh look, here's this stem cell technology. This technology could potentially prevent children from being born with, you know, threatening diseases. But all you get when in the papers is designer babies headline, right? It's exactly the same thing. And when these things are repeated and repeated, as they have been, GMOs and vaccines and nuclear, they just perpetuate this belief all the time, this belief that it's bad and it's evil, and it's the most scary thing. And it's the fear that really drives people's decisions. It's not the facts, it's the fear. So it has misrepresented facts, but I think it's done something more scary than that, which is use storytelling technique, which is the most important way that we communicate with each other, the most effective way, and just use that to perpetuate anti-nuclear sentiment. I think it's really dangerous at this point, and it's disappointing. But I completely understand that it's good storytelling. It's an easy story to tell, and lots of people identify with and can just watch it and have their own beliefs confirmed, even though it's not evidence based. But I have seen that it's been fact checked and quite widely debunked. So that information is not going to make headlines. It's not going to reach people. So I think it's that drama's done more damage than good, really. But it's always been this way. It's been this way for a long time. Although what I will say is I think there's a kind of anti-nuclear bias going on. I think if it was about vaccines, they wouldn't have even been able to make that. You could make a scary documentary about vaccines, or you could find a few people who have had adverse effects. You could pander to that and big anti-vaccine community who would want to watch that drama. It would just play on their fears, but you wouldn't do it. It would be morally wrong. Who would want to produce something like that? Look at what happened with Plandemic. I don't know if anyone heard about that documentary that was put on YouTube. Immediately spread these conspiracy theories about where COVID came from. Had a huge impact, and it had to be taken down, but not before millions of people watched it. We realised it was wrong, and yet things like Chernobyl get a free pass, but it's also wrong, and it's also misleading.
Zion, I did watch the Chernobyl drama. In its defence, it was fantastic drama. I think it kind of just put me off the Soviet Union more than nuclear energy. So I would just throw that in, really. Even the Soviet Union, it's true. The biggest problem with Chernobyl is that they didn't deal with it well, and they didn't even tell people it had happened. Right, for 3 days afterwards, they could have evacuated. They didn't. So that was the biggest problem. But the other thing is that it used a specific type of technology called RBMK, and those we don't use that anymore. Those reactors are not used. We realise they're flawed. We don't use that design. The tech has come a long way, and we've got much better options. But none of that even gets touched upon in these discussions about Chernobyl. When people say, "What about Chernobyl? It could happen again." No, it couldn't. No, it couldn't at all. Yeah. Okay, great. Let's go to Phil. Phil, what's your question or comment?
Am I allowed to have a little rant? Not a sort of riff rather than a question. First of all, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed all of what Zion said. I agreed with everything. I was sitting there going nod all the time. My life has been looking at nuclear power from both sides, because my job has been making sure that it's safe by making sure the technologies are applied correctly, but also advocating for it by talking to visitors, talking to all my friends who are in the green parenting sort of lobby that you described. So I've done both sides, but I've got a slightly more ambivalent point of view. I really enjoyed listening to all your positive stuff about nuclear, but I watched Chernobyl, and I've been there. That was my job for not to Chernobyl, but to all the other RBMKs. I visited all of the RBMK reactors apart from Chernobyl. I've been in those meetings with the ranks of Soviet engineers sitting there not saying anything because they don't want to upset the minister or whoever's in the meeting with them. So it was a really accurate drama from the point of view of all those details. There might have been one or two things that you could debunk. I can't remember what they said about the number of deaths in the end from the accidents. But and Zion knows as well as I do, the number of deaths is hugely exaggerated normally. It was a few dozen but they were horrible deaths. And I've got a slightly different point of view, which is that nuclear power can be really horribly dangerous. And if it's not designed correctly, if it's not regulated correctly, if it's not managed correctly in a country where there is a breakdown of control, society, political control. In a developed country, it works really well. We haven't had a big problem with our reactors, although we're still getting little things happening and we have to regulate quite strongly. It's a sort of technology where you really need strong control over it. Fukushima didn't kill anybody. One person died as a result of quite a high radiation dose in his job during the cleanup. But you're right, nobody died as a result of the releases from the accident. But if the wind had been blowing the other direction, there would have been a lot of people got a lot of radiation, and it could have been quite different. So that was. I'm still cautious about the idea that we put too positive a view. And then I think what you're really saying is we want to solve the world's problems by providing energy to all of the developing countries or countries like India by providing all of their power by nuclear stations. That would be an enormous number of nuclear stations in an enormous number of not very well regulated countries. I would be slightly concerned about. So I think you've got to be careful about it. But I think the sort of message that you've just come across with now is hugely needed, because you need it to counterbalance the ridiculously negative points of view in our countries.
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely not arguing that India should have widespread nuclear. I mean, what I was saying is they need development, and that means that they need fossil fuels. No one wants to hear it. No one wants to use more fossil fuels, but that is how we developed. That is how we got to this point. Up to us to bring our emissions down to net zero, to allow them some leeway in being able to develop. And probably they can't do it as widely as we did, but we certainly can't tell them that they can't. We just can't. And they need some infrastructure. They are the ones that are going to suffer the most. They need the infrastructure we have to protect themselves. They don't have the protections we have. So really, I'm not advocating. Can I answer all of the questions? So I'm not advocating for them to have nuclear. I'm advocating for us to get that down to net zero and accept that some of the developing countries will need to use some fossil fuels. So there, we probably need to look at more like carbon capture storage, which is a tech that's coming along, and that's a whole other discussion. But as for arguments about whether it's safe, the data shows it's safe, it's still bringing up things that could have happened that haven't happened. This is exactly what people say about vaccines. This is exactly the same arguments that people make. It's really about risk assessment. Yes, there is a small number of people that will have adverse reactions to vaccines. Yes, 12 people died in the Chernobyl blast, and actually Chernobyl wasn't well managed. Both of Chernobyl and Fukushima were level 7 meltdowns. They're high, right? So we actually know what happens in the worst case. But the cancers that were spread by Chernobyl, and they did spread cancer because they didn't manage it, they didn't evacuate people quickly enough. They were very easily treated, which is why it's hard to put numbers on it, because they actually think the numbers are really low. But then obviously you do need to take into account that people got sick as well, even if they got better, and it just becomes complicated. But that's all of that is taken into account by the research. So go to somewhere like ourworldindata.com/nuclear, have a look on there, and it will just tell you what all the data is, what the numbers are, and it still comes nowhere near to fossil fuels, because the impact from fossil fuels, from deaths from mining, from extraction, and air pollution, something like 5 million deaths from air pollution a year, are so high. That's what we need to realize. They're kind of invisible thing. It's just like vaccines. People can't see the impacts because it's visible illness. Well, nobody I know had polio. I'm not worried about that. But we need those to come back to realise, that how bad they are. We know that air pollution is a huge issue, and that's before you look at the link between fossil fuels and climate change, which is that fossil fuels are driving the destruction of our planet. That it's really about risk perception. No one's saying this is perfect. No one's saying that it shouldn't be regulated. Absolutely, it should be. And my understanding is that it's highly regulated. That actually it takes twice as long to build them now, because they added so many features to make it extra safe. That to me, it just comes down to whether or not you trust the scientists. whether or not you trust them to do. And I trust them enough to let my kids have vaccines. Some of those vaccines don't even have a huge consensus, you know, some of them have 60-70% consensus, and I still trust them. I still trust that they're going to be safe enough. And it just comes down to that, whether or not you have that faith in the scientific method.
Good answer. Yeah, great.
Is that okay, Phil? Should we move on? Yeah, great. Thanks, Phil. Aaron, I think you were next. If you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, well, great talk. Really enjoyed that. From my understanding, there needs to be a base load of energy in the country, and then a top-up load that can be instantly switched on, such as gas and hydro. Hydro we have very limited amounts of, and gas is one of those where you switch it on, and if somebody all switches their kettles on at the same time, it can meet the load. I don't think nuclear has that ability to react so quickly. So what would be an energy source that we could use for that to supplement the base load?
Well, this is where the IPCC data is useful, because they give 4 different scenarios of how that can work. And I mean, I'm not going to get into how we manage the energy grid. That's a different conversation. There's lots of experts who know far more than I do. But all I can tell you is that when the numbers are crunched, it's completely possible. We can do it. We can have mostly nuclear and a little bit of, you know, wind or whatever, you know, whatever. It depends on the country as well. It depends on the country. So, you know, here wind actually isn't that reliable, but as you say, we can't have hydro. Some countries are doing really well with hydro. So it completely depends on the energy mix and what the demand is. And here, you know, the demand's growing here, but it still you know, so France is a good example because they have 73% from nuclear, and then they have a little bit of fossil fuels and a little bit of renewables, and it works really well. They've just got a little bit that they can do, they need to cut out of the scenario, whereas we're right on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I think all I would say is it's entirely possible. The numbers have been crunched. I didn't do the maths, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you about the maths, but I highly recommend things like David Mackay's book, David Mackay's TED Talks, that will literally run you through the numbers and the way that the energy grid works and the way it could be managed. But at the moment, we're not even anywhere near that discussion in the UK, you know. Okay,
thank you.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Let's go to Paul Laurie next, because Paul, you had your physical hand up some time ago.
Yeah, Zion, thanks for the talk. I'm a physicist, so I don't have any problem with nuclear power. What you haven't mentioned is the costs. From what I've read, the cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear seems exceptionally high relative to the other products you can get. And I just wondered what you'd comment on that.
I think, again, it depends on how it's managed. So in France, the electricity is 1.7 times cheaper than in Germany. Germany has put lots of money into renewables. I mean, there's an example of where, you know, French people have really cheap electricity because they have mostly nuclear, but equally they could have mostly nuclear and then they could, you know, they could do things a different way and make people pay more. I think a lot of that comes down to governments and policy rather than the product. I mean, yes, Sizewell cost 20 billion to build, but then it gives us, you know, 58 years, between 50 and 80 years of clean energy to build Moorside as well, and Wilfer's just fallen through, sadly. But if we had more, that could potentially make it cheaper for all of us. You know, it boosts our economy, it brings jobs. The biggest thing with Wilfer, with Hitachi pulling out, I don't know if anyone's followed this, but basically Wilfer was all set to go ahead. Hitachi had actually poured lots of money into it. They were investing in it. They put something like 6 billion into it, but the government didn't commit to it on paper, and they didn't want to risk bankruptcy, and they pulled out. When they pulled out, they said, UK is not a friendly place for the nuclear industry. Like, we just can't afford to lose that money. And that really worries me, because I think it might happen with Sizewell next, and EDF might pull out, because they also have been waiting for a decision for months, which is why I'm campaigning for it. You know, it's not for the industry, it's for Britain. And so Wilfer now, that really, the unions have been really outspoken about this, and unions do tend to be very pro-nuclear actually in Britain, because they've just lost a ton of good jobs. Like that community in Wales, and they're very highly skilled jobs, a lot of them. You know, what you've got to question what that would put. I don't think I need to make the case that would put so much into our country and our economy. We're talking about, you know, a serious breakdown of like unemployment post-COVID, maybe even also post-Brexit. And here we've just lost 2,000 jobs, and many of them highly skilled jobs that are going to boost Wales, boost the British economy. You know, so you've got to, it depends on how you look at the cost. You know, it just depends on how you add it up, and it also depends on how governments manage it, because as I say, in France they've done it really well. They've got high energy security policy, and it's not super expensive. But another thing I'll point out though is the standardization. If you don't know about this really interesting data, it's based on the South Korean model, where they found that if they made a nuclear plant, it would take, you know, a certain amount of time, cost a certain amount of money, and it would be expensive, right? But if they then made another one and they use exactly the same model of standardization with the same engineers, it would cut years off the time. It would cut millions off the cost. This is really good data that provides a really strong case for standardization, and that's what I've been arguing for here, is that we don't just build Hinkley, we build Sizewell, that's just a replica with the same engineers, and then we build, you know, Wilfer the same way with the same engineers. The cost will come down if we do it that way, so it will become even cheaper. But you know, it's an uphill battle at the moment, trying to get that research, that information across to politicians who I talk to all the time, who in principle agree, read the research and agree, but then they don't do it. They look at short term it looks expensive, long term it's the cheapest option with the most amount of energy.
Okay, thank you, Zion. I'd like to bring in Simon Johnson. Simon has put some things in the chat. Simon is an advocate for stable salt reactors, which I believe may come online in about 8 years' time. Zion, I don't know if you have knowledge of that or a view of that, or if Simon wants to come in and say a little bit about that.
About advanced nuclear?
Yeah, they're called stable salt reactors, and they're kind of modular reactors that can literally fit on the back of a lorry.
There's a lot about stable salt reactors, SMRs, molten reactors. There's a lot of big research going on into advanced tech, but as you say, it's probably a decade away. And to be honest, I think it would take longer than that, because if it's anything new, that's new tech in nuclear, it needs to be super safe, and people need to be convinced that it's safe. So I think we're probably even further away. I mean, it's great if all this stuff comes in, that's fantastic, but it sounds a little bit to me like 15 years ago when I was campaigning for renewables, and people were saying the battery storage is just 10 years away. We'll have battery storage and then everything will be run on renewables. It never happened. It still hasn't happened. So I'm all for it, and I think we should always invest in it. We should always invest in this new, no question from my perspective. But we shouldn't rely on it. We need to build what we're able to build now, and that's because we're in a climate emergency. We need to bring our emissions down. You know, we can't wait around another 10 years. Frankly, if we'd done this 10 years ago, if we just built a load of nuclear 10 years ago, we wouldn't be in this position, would we?
Okay, Simon, do you want to come in on that?
Well, the Canadians are probably going to have the first stable salt reactor running in somewhere between 2028 and 2030. It'll actually be running, which is that's quite soon, really, in nuclear power station terms. And I know what worries me is that our government is funding or following it down the lines of a technology that is too expensive. I mean, Hinkley Point C and Sizewell Point C, if it happens, will never make a difference to climate change, not a significant difference, because it's just too expensive. It's not going to take off around the world. Whereas the stable salt reactor, the studies show that it's going to be cheaper to build and run than coal power stations. And if we're going to solve climate change, we've got to have plenty of electricity, and it's got to be cheap, and it's got to be safe. And the stable salt reactor does all those things. What we should be doing is getting our government to support the building of the first stable salt reactor in the UK. Nearly all of the work's done on it, the design work. This isn't a sort of a theoretical sort of thing that might or might not happen. This is really going to happen. And we just need it to happen sooner, so that we can get cheap nuclear that's completely safe. You can't have accidents like in Fukushima and Chernobyl with a stable salt reactor, because you don't get radioactive gases produced in the fuel pins. So you can't contaminate large areas of land. It just simply can't happen. And, you know, so it's safe, cheaper than coal, and it actually clears up our legacy nuclear waste. It gets rid of it. So with that sort of technology, it could really make a difference across the whole world. Mainly the fact that it's cheap means that people will want these reactors. And our government's just supporting the wrong technology. It's a red herring to build these expensive nuclear power stations. I know we need it because we need electricity right now, but it's not going to help in terms of the climate emergency, because there'll just be a few of these big reactors around, not a significant proportion of the world's electricity. Whereas if we went with these stable salt reactors, everybody who sells electricity would want to buy them. And yeah, and the other point is that people worry about the way renewables go up and down in terms of the power they can produce, depending on the sun and wind and so on, and how you fill the gaps. Well, these stable salt reactors, they're load following, so they respond instantly to changes in power demand. There's no problem there. You can just plug them into a network with renewables and they'll control themselves to meet the gaps. So it solves the problem with the gaps in the renewables. It's cheap and it's safe, completely safe. So I really think we need to be getting our government to pay more attention to this technology. And I'm not sure the best way of going about that.
Leon, do you want to come back briefly on that?
I'd just be repeating myself, but again, you know, nuclear is safe. Look at David Mackay's work, look at the IPCC report that says we need nuclear to bring down carbon emissions. You don't have to listen to my point of view. If you want to disagree with most of the scientists, experts in the world on this, then we just agree to disagree.
Well, I'm not sure what we're disagreeing about.
No. You said that current nuclear couldn't bring down emissions?
No.
The opposite.
No, I don't think we actually need renewables. I think we do it all with nuclear myself. But no, the point is that the stable salt reactor works very well with renewables, because
It's a nuclear reactor.
Yes, you know, I'm talking about a nuclear reactor. It's a fast reactor.
It's an advanced modular reactor. Sorry.
It's a type of molten salt fast reactor.
I know. Yeah, I know.
It's very cheap.
Yeah.
It's very cheap to run because the molten salt that contains the fuel is in fuel pins rather than running in the primary circuit like it does in most molten salt reactors. No, I'm saying this is the way ahead. I think, to build lots of these reactors they're very safe. You build them on a production line in a factory and ship them out to wherever you want them. They simply can't have accidents like Fukushima and Chernobyl because they don't produce the radioactive gases. It can't happen. The worst you could imagine is a meltdown, but it wouldn't do any harm. It would just go into the sump of the reactor. So these reactors are completely safe. The studies show they're cheaper than even coal power stations. In fact, you can take an old coal power station, take the coal burning side of it away and replace it with the stable salt reactor and carry on with all the rest of the infrastructure of the power station. So you can upgrade the coal power station in this way.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you said that. I'm just talking about nuclear that we can build right now. That's all I can campaign for right now.
They're starting to build them in Canada. I mean, will happen by 2028 or 2030 perhaps. That is right now in terms of nuclear.
Okay, let's thanks, Simon. Let's move on to another question. Barry, you've been waiting some time. If you can remember what your question was, Barry, shall we bring you in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the very stimulating talk. We've spoken at great length about energy requirements, somewhat about climate, somewhat about water, somewhat about food, but we've avoided the vast elephant in the room that is driving all these things. And it's an elephant that's growing in size, and that is population. All discussions on environmental matters seem, as a matter of routine, to leave out the primary driver. At the beginning of the last century, there were 1 billion people on the earth. There are about 7.5 now, and it's going to go to 10.5 plus, quite predictably. With this increase, there's going to be increased demand, and the people themselves in what we call developing countries are justifiably, as you pointed out, demanding development. Development means pollution, energy, and so on. I don't think anything that's been suggested at this meeting can save us from some kind of catastrophe. And I think it would be more sensible and more mature to try and manage the catastrophe rather than try and dodge it. It's too big, it's moving too fast, there's going to be a lot of damage, there will probably be a lot of wars and a lot of deaths. But we need to look the problem squarely in the face and try and mitigate rather than cure, because I think we're fooling ourselves. I think talking about cures and reversing trends and cleaning up the world is pure fantasy. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, mitigating is really important. Adapting also where we can is important. That's what all the evidence shows. Population is a really tricky subject. There's some good data that shows that as people are lifted out of poverty, their emissions go down. They tend to have less children. That's why even if they develop, they have less children. Women get access to birth control. They get access to education. So, for example, my mum was one of 11. She came to this country, she had 6 children, and then of them, she's got like 3 grandchildren. You know, it's happened naturally. Obviously, that's just an example, but I'd urge you to look at the data. There's a really good TED talk on this by Hans Rosling. He's a statistician that studied this very specifically. And he said, look, the more people we lift out of poverty, the more sustainable population become, because those people are more healthy and they live longer. Those people, they have less children, and because they have access to a higher quality of life, they have less children. And David Attenborough mentioned this as well in his documentary, which talks about population quite a bit. If you're interested in the topic, you know, it's worth having a look. And he basically concludes the same thing, that look, we need to lift people out of poverty in order to deal with this issue, because what's the alternative? You know, there isn't really an alternative unless you're talking about, you know, authoritarian rules about people having children, which I don't think anybody really wants.
Yes. Can I come back?
Go ahead, Barry. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the figures I was quoting do take into account the slowing of population growth with smaller families, but we have a way to go to climb up the graph of the hill, and it's going to settle out at well over 10 billion, which is a very substantial increase on what we have now. It's a third. The population of the world is going to go up by a third. And yes, I agree that smaller families will become the norm, but each one of those fewer children are going to make far greater demands in terms of the quality of their diet, the consumption of their energy, and the amount of pollution and global warming they generate. Children living in a poor village, as opposed to children living in a sophisticated society and making all the demands that young sophisticated children do, are quite different. So yes, you are absolutely right. Family size and reproduction will go down, but not in time for another huge surge in population and demand. Thank you.
Okay, shall we move on to Simon Whipple? Simon, you put a number of things in chat, but do you want to summarise your points?
Sure. I put a couple of things in chat, but I think the only one I'd ask Sion for her views on, and hopefully her expert thoughts, is the question of how we can actually make sure that the PR effort, the public relations effort you're carrying out now and that you used to for Extinction Rebellion is made really effective. Those who took part in the Extinction Rebellion have consistently felt that they haven't actually managed really to get, although the message is well known by the general public, the decision makers are to a great extent only paying lip service. And you perhaps feel the same way now you're working for the nuclear industry, that somehow there is not necessarily malignant, but at least a force which is stopping governments, the world, doing what it needs to do. Would you like to comment on that? And if you feel that some means by which those who, the influences, that is people like you, can actually ensure that your voice is not just heard, but effective?
Sure. So I actually don't work for the nuclear industry. I don't take any money from industry, and I have no links to the industry. In fact, here's a funny story. I recently did this protest. I started this protest group called Nuclear for Net Zero, the first pro-nuclear kind of green group in the UK, because traditionally nuclear is not seen as a green thing, funnily enough. And we went up to Sizewell and we swam in the water there, you know, and gave out free bananas. And I had an email from someone at EDF, don't know this person, never met him. He'd seen that we were doing this event and he said, you know, you want us to turn up and vet attendees. In fact, he didn't phrase it like that. He phrased it as, we want to turn up and vet the attendees because we know there are some characters who are anti-nuclear in the area. And then I said, please don't do that to my event. This event has nothing to do with you, but also it's an open event on the beach. You can't vet people, right? You can't turn people away. That's ridiculous. And speaking as a long-term campaigner who's been arrested for doing climate action, who's been, you know, I got banned from all RBS banks in Scotland in 2010 because I shut down a bank because they're investing in tar sands. You know, I'm not worried about a few protesters turning up. I think it's good if they turn up because you can have conversations. But what really showed me was how weak the industry is. This is a comms person. They don't believe in their own product. They're so afraid. I said, why are you so afraid of just a few people airing their views? It's okay. It's okay for them to do that. And also, you know, then he replied and he said, I'm just worried about negative fallout and us having to deal with it if there's negativity. And I said, what's more negative than Sizewell not being built and you losing your job? Because if it's not built, all of your jobs are gone, right? So I take it a little bit personally when people think I work from the industry, because the industry isn't doing anything. They aren't doing anything, and they should be. They should be.
Okay, I apologise if I had the impression you were employed by the nuclear industry, but and obviously I apologise that you're upset that I made that allegation. However, my principal question still stands as to how on earth we actually get through to the decision makers, to follow the science.
Yeah, no, I'm not upset. I was leading into where this has brought me to. So I realised, you know, the industry aren't capable of doing this. So people need to go out and advocate for themselves, really. The things that I've been doing, speaking to politicians, you know, having exactly the same conversations that we're having now and urging them to go away and look at information. They tend to have quite high science capital, so they can do it, you know, and public speaking and writing about it. I've had, you know, just had a column in the Telegraph about it. I had one in the Mail. It's just really about getting other voices out there. And it's very similar to what we did with Extinction Rebellion, because in the beginning, we were talking to newspapers and saying, look, you need to cover climate in this way. And they would say, well, we are covering it. And we'd say, but you're not, but when you do, so for example, BBC is a good example, because they would have a climate scientist on and they'd have it as a debate with a climate denier. And we went there and we said, look, you wouldn't have a doctor and someone who doesn't believe that you have organs. You wouldn't have a doctor and a homeopath, or, you know, you can't, why are you doing this? And they listened to us and they realized that they were kind of accidentally misrepresenting the science and they shouldn't have been doing it. And they changed their policy on it. It's exactly the same with nuclear, where all of the papers really print anti-nuclear stuff that isn't based on evidence. And I call the journalist up and I said, you realise that you've printed this piece and that's not what the evidence says. And they genuinely don't realise. They just go, oh, well, I thought that is what experts say. And I say, well, I'll put you in touch with an expert and speak to them and see what you think. And some of them have then come out and written better, you know, better articles on the issues that are more balanced. Some of them are just anti-nuclear and they will always be anti-nuclear, and there's nothing that I can do about that. But I'm just trying to get in a voice on the other side to advocate for the evidence, just to show that, look, there is more than one side to this debate. And also there has been an anti-nuclear bias in the press and in the public for quite a long time. So just like with the climate denial, so that really needs unpicking, and any conversations you have about it is helpful because it helps people they think about it. And I don't think that I have to convince people. I'm just having the conversations. They can go away and look up the information and be convinced or not, and that's completely up to them. But most people do seem to come around, including people I used to work with in Extinction Rebellion who contacted me and said, you know what, I didn't realize this, but actually you're right. And that, you know, that's music to my ears, because it means that shift is happening. And again, it's about risk, really, isn't it? You know, if climate change wasn't happening, I wouldn't be advocating for nuclear. Why would I care? But I care because 73% of our emissions come from energy, and so we need to deal with this part of the issue right now. The industry's not doing it. It needs more advocates. It needs more discussion. It needs more articles in papers. If you see an article in a paper that's scientifically wrong, it needs to be challenged. And in fact, I just challenged something. There's a researcher called Sovacool. Is anyone aware of him? David Sovacool. He wrote a paper 4 years ago claiming that nuclear doesn't bring down emissions and that renewables do. The paper contained made-up data, right? It's really worth looking up if you're interested. So the paper had to be retracted after a mathematician wrote a blog post, and the mathematician's name is Nicholas Thomas. He wrote a blog post completely tearing the paper apart, and it had to be retracted. You know, and it's kind of like, well, who's upholding the scientific method there if peer review didn't pick that up? First of all, that's dangerous for science. Secondly, what's just happened last week is Sovacool has now published another paper in Nature, and it makes the same argument after his paper was retracted four years ago. And I immediately emailed the journal and I said, what is going on with your peer review process? Did you not vet this information? Because I've seen headlines in Science Daily, I've seen headlines in New Scientist, I've seen headlines across the board reporting this data that is not factually, but it's shoddy research. It's just like when the Lancet published Wakefield's paper that claimed that the MMR vaccine causes autism. He used a sample of 12 kids. It turned out that he hadn't even asked permission from most of the parents when he took samples from those kids. Therefore, he breached ethics. You know, there were lots of issues involved, but really that paper should never have been printed. And look at the damage it's done. Look at the damage it's done. The credibility and belief in vaccine, just that single paper, really that falls on scientific community to be more vigilant about these things. And at Nature, to their credit, this time they emailed me straight back and said, you know, we're getting a lot of complaints and we are looking into it, but I fear that the fact that it's already made headlines everywhere, some damage has been done, and they need to retract that, not with a little apology like they did last time, but with a more fuller, you know, explanation and a commitment to make sure that they uphold the review process, because without it we lose scientific credibility. Without it, we're not doing a good job.
Okay, thank you. Let's Phil, would you like another bite of the cherry? Do you want to come in?
It was just a little one, really. I think I want to stick up for the industry a bit, since I come from the industry, because I think you're being a bit hard on the industry, because if you think about it, if the industry starts saying, oh, nuclear power is great and perfectly safe, and no one's going to listen, they're all going to think they're completely biased and just trying to push their own, advocate for their own jobs. So I think you're in a much better position to do that, and you're doing a very good job at it. So that was all I wanted to chip in with. Sorry.
Yeah, but if you compare it though to the fossil fuel industry, I mean, come on, they're lobbyists. Rebranding gas as natural gas, so clever. Imagine if we did that for an actual safe product. You know, that's all I mean. That they got to, someone in the industry's got to stand up for their product, because the fossil fuels are not going to stop doing it. They're not going to stop doing it, and they're very powerful. Yeah,
there is another little thing, which is that we've all in the nuclear industry had to sign the Official Secret Act, and we're not supposed to talk about it just as individuals, really. It's historical, and it's all to do with it being linked with the weapons program a long time ago. So and
even just arguing for jobs, that could be a good.
Say it again, sorry.
But what about the angle of arguing for jobs?
Well, I don't like that. The miners were arguing for their jobs, weren't they?
But they're right to.
Okay, let's maybe leave that one. Zion, I wonder if you could just briefly explain what you meant by the phrase science capital. You've used that a couple of times.
So this is a term that we use in science communication that looks at, so this it's a really project actually, it's worth looking up if you're interested in it. They take a single individual and they look at the amount of science they're exposed to. It's not even necessarily your education at school. I mean, we all get taught science at school, right? But it's stuff like, do you know anyone who works in science? Do you have a female that works in science if you're a young girl? You know, what's your actual exposure, the actual functioning world of science? Do you watch scientific documentaries? You know, how much do you watch them compared to your neighbour? All of those things, if you tick the boxes, it's basically a list of things. And if you tick the boxes, you have high science capital. And I looked at it and I have really high science capital, right? A lot of my friends are scientists, but the reality is that a lot of people have really low science capital. They don't even have a friend who works as a scientist. They live in a completely different world. They don't watch any documentaries, you know, they don't just have low science capital. And so really, even when you're talking about any of these issues, you're starting from a different place if there's someone with high science capital versus someone with low, because someone with low may not even understand the real basics of what the scientific method is, you know. And so if you're starting up here talking about issues that involve the scientific method, it's just not even going to work. You've got to look at where their science capital is. And also, if you want to improve people's understanding and appreciation of science, you've got to bring the capital up, rather than just assuming that you can catch them up yourself. That's a deficit model again, but it's just making sure people have those opportunities. So say we want more girls to go into science, they need to see women in science, right? They need to see that women are winning the Nobel Prize, which has just happened, you know, but still a really tiny number of the Nobel Prizes have gone to women overall. They need to see women advocate for science. How many science communicators do you see who are women? You know, the ones that I think of, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, Bill Nye, there's not a lot of women that come straight to my mind. And I'm a woman, you know, who cares about these issues, who has 2 young daughters who I'd love to go into science. So but my daughters already have high science capital. I realize they're already benefiting from that. So it's a really useful term because it's linked to a lot of data in how to engage more people with science.
Okay. Just make a couple of points. Dorset Humanists have got fantastically high science capital because you know, we're all scientifically literate and we're always promoting it. But also the president of Humanists UK is Professor Alice Roberts. So, you know, would you count her as a good science advocate? I hope.
I mean, I want to say yes, but I haven't seen her on anything. You know, did she have a TV show? We need more women in these shows, right? Yeah, or just YouTube. YouTube's really popular now.
She does do stuff on television, yeah. Okay, we're nearly out of time, people. Aaron, you've still got your hand up. Did you want to come in with something else? No? Okay. Okay, well, I think, as it's gone 3:30 and we normally try to finish at 3:30, I'd just like to thank you again, Zion, for a really fantastically stimulating evening. If people would like to show their appreciation, you can do it so electronically, or you can just clap silently, and we'll get we've got lots of positive strokes for you there, Zion. So best of luck with all of your advocacy work. I think you've certainly got a lot of support here today, and we'll try to spread the word through our bulletin and our sort of regional magazine as well.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, best of luck. Bye for now.